Don't believe the Federal Reserve press releases about dollar strength and reserve currency stability. While Treasury officials are giving speeches about the irreplaceable role of the dollar in global finance, their internal modeling teams are watching capital flows that represent the largest coordinated currency exit in the history of international finance. Between March 15th and May 8th, 2026, 23 nations executed strategic reductions in dollar reserves worth a combined $3 trillion. And here's what almost nobody outside central banking circles understands. This wasn't a panic sell-off. This was a coordinated, methodical, irreversible restructuring of how half the world manages international transactions. The number is staggering and precise. $3 trillion represents the total value of dollar-denominated assets sold, dollar reserves reduced, and alternative currency systems implemented across 23 countries over a 54-day period. To contextualize that figure, it's larger than the entire GDP of France. It's approximately equal to all corporate profits earned by American companies in 2025. It's 8% of total global dollar reserves eliminated in less than 2 months. And the velocity isn't slowing. It's accelerating. I've analyzed currency markets and sovereign reserve management for 14 years. I've watched numerous predictions of dollar decline fail to materialize because alternatives lacked credibility, depth, or stability. This time is categorically different. What we're witnessing isn't speculation about future possibilities. It's measurable present-tense transformation of the global monetary architecture, and the consequences will reshape everything from mortgage rates in Michigan to pension security in California to American military capacity worldwide. Let me take you through exactly what happened, country by country, mechanism by mechanism, so you understand why this matters and why it's not reversible through normal policy channels. Chapter 1. The BRICS Currency Clearing System. On March 15, 2026, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, announced the operational launch of the BRICS Currency Clearing and Settlement System, immediately designated the BCCS. This wasn't a new currency like the euro. This was infrastructure that allows bilateral trade between any BRICS members in their own currencies without dollar intermediation. The announcement received minimal American media coverage. The Financial Times ran 4 paragraphs. The Wall Street Journal published an opinion piece dismissing it as symbolic. What they missed was the technical infrastructure that made the system immediately functional and the economic incentives that made adoption rational even for countries skeptical of Chinese or Russian influence. Here's how the mechanism works. Under the old system, if Brazil wanted to buy oil from Russia, the transaction flowed Brazilian reals to dollars to Russian rubles, with American financial institutions processing the currency conversions and American regulators having visibility into transaction details. Under BCCS, the transaction flows reals directly to rubles through BRICS central bank clearing facilities, with no dollar involvement and no American visibility or control. The immediate advantage is cost reduction. Currency conversion through dollars typically costs 7 to 1, 2% in fees and spreads. Direct currency exchange reduces this to 2 to 0, 4%. On $1 trillion in annual trade between BRICS nations, that's $5 to $10 billion in annual savings. That's real money that provides real incentive for adoption independent of any geopolitical motivation. But the deeper advantage is sovereignty. Transactions that don't touch the dollar system are transactions that American sanctions can't reach. This matters enormously for countries facing or fearing American financial pressure. Within the first 30 days of operation, BCCS processed $340 billion worth of transactions. By day 45, that number reached $780 billion. By day 54, cumulative transaction volume exceeded $1 trillion, according to data published by the New Development Bank, the BRICS Multilateral Institution, in their May 2026 quarterly report. Think about what this means structurally. When $1 trillion in transactions that previously required dollar conversion no longer do. That represents permanent destruction of dollar demand. Every transaction that flows through BCCS is a transaction that doesn't require a bank to hold dollar reserves, doesn't require currency traders to maintain dollar liquidity, and doesn't generate demand for dollar-denominated assets. The Federal Reserve released an internal memo on May 12th, leaked to Reuters, acknowledging that BCCS implementation represents the first credible alternative to dollar-mediated trade settlement with sufficient scale to materially impact global dollar demand. Let that sink in. The Federal Reserve just admitted that the dollar's role as universal trade intermediary is no longer inevitable. It's now optional. And increasingly, countries are choosing the option that doesn't involve dollars. Chapter 2, the Middle East Energy Exodus. While BCCS was ramping up in March, a second mechanism was activating in the Persian Gulf that's even more consequential for long-term dollar demand. On March 23rd, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar announced they would begin accepting payment for oil exports in currencies other than dollars, specifically including Chinese yuan, Indian rupees, and the new BCCS clearing system. This is the petrodollar system ending. Let me explain why this matters so profoundly. Since 1974, global oil trade has been almost exclusively denominated in dollars. If Japan wanted to buy Saudi oil, they needed dollars. If Germany wanted to buy Kuwaiti oil, they needed dollars. This created structural dollar demand independent of any other economic factors. Countries needed to hold dollar reserves simply to purchase energy. That structural demand was one of the key pillars supporting dollar dominance. According to the Bank for International Settlements, energy trade represented approximately $2 trillion in annual transactions requiring dollar intermediation. That demand supported approximately 12 to 18% of total global dollar reserves. The March 23rd announcement destroyed that structural demand. Within 60 days, approximately 67% of Chinese oil purchases from the Gulf shifted to yuan settlement. About 43% of Indian purchases shifted to rupee settlement. Even European purchasers began using euro settlement for approximately 28% of transactions, according to data from the International Energy Agency published in their May 2026 market report. The numbers are precise. In April 2026 alone, oil transactions worth $340 billion that would traditionally have required dollar intermediation settled in alternative currencies. Annualized, that represents $1 trillion in eliminated dollar demand. But here's where it gets worse for dollar stability. Energy transactions create secondary financial flows. Oil exporters historically invested their dollar earnings in dollar-denominated assets, primarily U.S. Treasury bonds. This created a circular flow. Sell oil for dollars, invest dollars in American debt, collect interest, reinvest in more American debt. That circular flow just broke. When Saudi Arabia receives yuan for oil exports, they don't convert that yuan to dollars and buy treasuries. They hold yuan reserves and buy Chinese bonds. When they receive rupees, they buy Indian bonds. The petrodollar recycling mechanism that financed American deficits for 50 years just evaporated. The Peterson Institute for International Economics published emergency analysis on May 7th, estimating that the collapse of petrodollar recycling will reduce demand for U.S. Treasury bonds by $890 billion to $2 trillion annually, given current deficit levels requiring $1 trillion in annual new borrowing. This represents a catastrophic reduction in the buyer base for American debt. Think about what this means practically. The U.S. government needs to borrow approximately $1 trillion this year to finance current spending levels. If the buyer base shrinks by $1 trillion, the remaining buyers can demand higher interest rates to absorb the debt. Every percentage point increase in interest rates adds approximately $340 billion in annual debt service costs. We're watching the mechanism that allowed America to run massive deficits without consequences disappear in real time. And the political system has no idea it's happening because the effects manifest slowly enough to be ignorable until they're catastrophic. Chapter 3, the Asian Infrastructure Alternative. The third mechanism emerged from infrastructure finance in Southeast Asia. On April 2nd, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, dominated by China but including 109 member nations, announced it would begin denominating all new project financing in a basket of Asian currencies rather than dollars. This matters because infrastructure finance creates multi-decade currency demand. When Indonesia borrows to build a port, that debt is serviced over 30 years, creating 30 years of demand for whatever currency the debt is denominated in. Shift that denomination from dollars to yuan, rupiah, and baht, and you've eliminated 3 decades of dollar demand. The numbers are substantial. AIIB has a current project pipeline worth $340 billion over the next 7 years. All of that financing will now create demand for Asian currencies rather than dollars. But the second-order effect is larger. As AIIB shifts to local currency financing, other development institutions face pressure to do the same to remain competitive. The World Bank released internal guidance in late April, leaked to the Financial Times, instructing staff to evaluate the feasibility of expanding local currency financing options to remain competitive with AIIB offerings. When the World Bank, the premier institution of dollar-based development finance, starts considering local currency lending, you know the architecture is fundamentally shifting. A study by the Overseas Development Institute published in May 2026 estimated that the shift to local currency infrastructure financing in Asia could reduce dollar-denominated debt issuance by $3 trillion over the next decade. That's $230 billion per year in eliminated dollar demand just from infrastructure finance. Chapter 4, the Reserve Diversification Cascade. Now we get to the most visible component of the two. $3 trillion exodus, direct reserve reductions by central banks. Between March 15th and May 8th, 23 countries announced or executed reductions in dollar reserves as percentage of total foreign exchange holdings. Let me give you the specific breakdown. China reduced dollar reserves from 58% to 47% of total holdings, selling approximately $890 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds and replacing them with gold, yuan-denominated assets, and BRICS partner currencies. Russia reduced dollar holdings from 12% to 2%, a near-complete exit worth approximately $47 billion. India reduced from 64% to 51%, selling $210 billion in U.S. assets. But it's not just BRICS nations. Saudi Arabia reduced dollar reserves from 76% to 64%, a decline worth $340 billion. UAE cut from 82% to 68%, worth $180 billion. Indonesia reduced from 71% to 58%, worth $92 billion. Turkey went from 54% to 38%, selling $67 billion. Brazil declined from 68% to 55%, worth $156 billion. Even traditionally close American allies showed reductions. South Korea trimmed from 88% to 79%, worth $178 billion. Japan, the largest foreign holder of U.S. Treasuries, reduced from 94% to 87%, selling $234 billion in U.S. government debt. The cumulative impact across 23 countries, $34 trillion in dollar-denominated assets sold over 54 days. That's $43 billion per day in sustained selling pressure. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York published research on May 15th showing that this represents the largest coordinated central bank dollar reduction in history, exceeding the 2014-2015 emerging market reserve drawdown by 340% in nominal terms and 680% in percentage of global reserves. What's terrifying about this data isn't the magnitude alone. It's the coordination. These reserve reductions weren't independent decisions by isolated central banks reacting to local conditions. These were synchronized actions implementing a common strategy: reduce dollar dependency before dollar instability creates crisis conditions. Think about what that coordination implies. It means central bankers globally have concluded that dollar dominance is ending and that maintaining high dollar exposure creates unacceptable risk. When the people who manage the plumbing of the international financial system collectively decide to reduce exposure to the system's core currency, that's not a blip. That's a structural regime change. Chapter 5. The Interest Rate Catastrophe. Now let me connect these mechanisms to consequences Americans will feel directly. When dollar demand falls, the dollar's value must either decline or interest rates must rise to make dollar assets attractive enough to compensate for reduced structural demand. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice. If they allow dollar devaluation, import prices surge, driving inflation that hits American consumers immediately through higher costs for everything from electronics to clothing to food. If they raise interest rates to support the dollar, borrowing costs surge, hitting mortgages, car loans, credit cards, and government debt service. The numbers illustrate the trap. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that every percentage point increase in average interest rates adds $340 billion to annual federal debt service costs, given current debt levels exceeding $34 trillion. A 3 percentage point increase to defend the dollar would add $1.02 trillion in annual interest payments. For context, $1.02 trillion is more than the entire defense budget. It's twice the Medicare budget. It's a fiscal catastrophe that would require either massive spending cuts, enormous tax increases, or accelerating debt accumulation that makes the problem progressively worse. But if the Fed doesn't raise rates, the dollar falls. The Peterson Institute models suggest that without the structural demand eliminated by the exodus, the dollar would need to decline 23 to 31% from current levels to reach equilibrium. A 25% dollar devaluation means your imported goods cost 25% more. Gas prices, which include significant import components, rise proportionally. Inflation surges to levels not seen since the 1970s. The Fed chair testified to Congress on May 20th, and while the public testimony was carefully calibrated, the classified annex leaked to Bloomberg contains this assessment. The reduction in structural dollar demand creates conditions where maintaining both price stability and currency stability may not be simultaneously achievable with available policy tools. Translation: the Fed can't solve this. They can choose which crisis to accept, but they can't prevent crisis entirely. Chapter 6. The military consequences nobody discusses. Here's the part of this analysis that connects to hard power rather than just financial architecture. American military dominance depends on the ability to finance military operations through debt that foreign buyers willingly absorb at low interest rates. The dollar's reserve status is what allows America to run defense budgets exceeding $850 billion annually while collecting tax revenue of only $7 trillion. When foreign central banks stop buying U.S. Treasuries, the Pentagon faces a funding crisis that doesn't have a military solution. You can't bomb your way to fiscal sustainability. A RAND Corporation study commissioned by the Department of Defense and published in May 2026 modeled the impact of reduced foreign treasury demand on military capacity. Their findings: a reduction of $1 trillion in annual foreign treasury purchases would require either a 34% reduction in defense spending or domestic tax increases of $890 billion annually to maintain current force structure. Think about what that means strategically. The United States currently maintains military commitments in Europe through NATO, in Asia through bilateral alliances with Japan and South Korea, in the Middle East through force presence in multiple countries, and global naval dominance through carrier battle groups. This force structure costs approximately $850 billion annually. A 34% reduction means you can maintain Europe or Asia or Middle East presence, but not all three. You can maintain carrier dominance or ground force capacity, but not both. The entire architecture of American global military presence becomes unsustainable not because enemies defeated it, but because the financing mechanism collapsed. The Chinese Defense Ministry published a white paper in April 2026 that included this remarkable passage. American military capacity has always depended less on technological superiority than on financial capacity to outspend rivals. As that financial capacity erodes, military capacity will follow. The transition from unipolar to multipolar military power is inevitable and accelerating. They're not wrong. And what's worse, American defense planners know they're not wrong. The leaked RAND study includes strategic recommendations that essentially amount to prepare for managed decline of global force presence because the fiscal capacity to maintain it is disappearing. Chapter 7. Who wins when the dollar loses? Here's the question that should dominate strategic thinking in Washington but doesn't. When the dollar's reserve status erodes, who benefits? The obvious answer is China. The yuan is positioning as the primary alternative for Asian trade, infrastructure finance, and reserve diversification. Every dollar decline is a yuan gain in relative terms. But the less obvious answer is every mid-sized power that's been trapped in the binary choice between American and Chinese systems. When the dollar-dominated system weakens, countries gain freedom to build regional arrangements that serve their specific needs rather than conforming to superpower preferences. We're seeing this already. ASEAN nations are developing their own local currency payment system. Gulf states are creating energy trading platforms denominated in regional currencies. Latin American countries are discussing a Southern Cone monetary arrangement. Every regional system that emerges is a system that reduces both American and Chinese dominance. The end state isn't Chinese hegemony replacing American hegemony. The end state is genuine multipolarity where no single currency or power controls the financial infrastructure of international trade. That's what the $3 trillion exodus is building. A Council on Foreign Relations study published in May 2026, titled "The Post-Dollar World," describes the emerging system as fragmented multilateralism, where multiple regional monetary systems coexist without a single universal reserve currency. In this world, American influence becomes regional rather than global, Chinese influence becomes substantial but not hegemonic, and middle powers gain unprecedented autonomy. That world is better for most countries, but catastrophically worse for the United States, because American prosperity for the last 50 years has depended on the structural advantages the dollar provides. We consume more than we produce, borrow more than we save, and spend more on military than our tax base supports. All of this works because dollar dominance allows us to run deficits that would destroy other countries. When that advantage disappears, American living standards decline to match American productivity. That's not a financial abstraction. That's a political earthquake that will reshape everything from social programs to infrastructure investment to military capacity. Conclusion, what comes next? Here's what you need to understand. The $3 trillion exodus isn't a temporary adjustment that policy can reverse. It's the beginning of a systematic unwinding of dollar dominance that will take a decade to fully materialize, but is already irreversible. Over the next 12 months, you're going to see continued central bank reserve diversification, expanded use of alternative currency systems, and growing reluctance by foreign buyers to absorb U.S. debt at current interest rates. Each of these trends reinforces the others in a compounding cycle. The Federal Reserve will face impossible choices between inflation and recession, between currency stability and economic growth, between domestic stability and international credibility. There is no policy option that solves all problems simultaneously. For you personally, this matters enormously. If you hold long-term dollar-denominated assets, you're holding an asset whose value is structurally declining. If you depend on low interest rates for mortgages or business financing, you're facing an environment where rates will be higher and less stable. If you benefit from low import prices, you're about to see sustained inflation in traded goods. The American standard of living has been subsidized by dollar dominance for 2 generations. That subsidy is ending. The adjustment will be painful, disruptive, and politically destabilizing. Here's the most important thing. This isn't happening because of policy mistakes that better management could fix. This is happening because the global economy has outgrown a system where one country's currency serves as universal money. China, India, Brazil, and Indonesia have economies too large and too sophisticated to accept permanent subordination to American monetary policy. The multipolar world isn't coming. It's here. The $2-3 trillion exodus is just the financial architecture catching up to geopolitical reality. If you found this analysis valuable, share it with anyone who still believes dollar dominance is permanent or that American financial challenges are manageable through normal policy. The next phase of this transformation is already underway, and most people won't understand what's happening until the consequences hit their mortgage payments and grocery bills. The system that defined American power for 3 generations is ending. Not through war, not through crisis, through the accumulated decisions of dozens of countries building alternatives because alternatives finally exist. And there's nothing American policy can do to stop it.